You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todayswillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Wills and Probate podcast. Today I'm talking about the Great Wealth Transfer. For those of you that don't know, Dave Newick, CEO of Arken Group, will explain a little bit more about what it is and what it means for the industry as well. Dave, a regular contributor to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast. It's lovely to have you back, Dave. Thanks very much indeed for joining.
Oh, thank you, David. Great to be back.
So, if in the first instance, for the uninitiated, you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about yourself, what you do, Dave, and then if you wouldn't mind moving on to tell us about what the Great Wealth Transfer is.
Sure. Yeah, no problem at all. Well, look, firstly, if there is possibly anybody out there who hasn't heard me explain that I'm not Australian, let's get that out of the way first. I am a New Zealander. I've been here for 6 years in this iteration. So I came across to lead the Arken.legal business as it was then, and it's now 3 different businesses. We've got the escrow platform and a business also in New Zealand, which is digital estate planning and financial wellbeing called Footprint. So we're a group of companies now. My background is in leading businesses. I've run my own businesses. I've sold businesses. I've done startups, and I've done a lot of transformation work. And here I am as a Gen Xer to put that one into context, talking about this transformational shift in global wealth that is the Great Wealth Transfer. So let's get stuck into that. For those of you that aren't perhaps familiar with what that actually is, the cohort of births immediately after the Second World War, so starting from 1946 through to 1964, is a cohort of 16.8 million people. They are the wealthiest generation that has ever existed in humankind. Here in the UK, that generation holds 80% of the UK's wealth.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And not surprising in some ways, because you think about the wealth that's been accumulated over those years with property values and everything else. But 80% of that. So what does that actually look like? Well, if we think about the cohort, the oldest baby boomer is now 78 years of age. If we look at that from an average age of death perspective, in the UK, the average age of death is 80.7 years. So we're now starting to approach the stage, and in fact, some would say that we're already in it because males die on average sooner than females. This big cohort of 16.8 million people is going to start to pass away. And what that does is it means that wealth, 80% of the UK's private wealth, is going to be transitioned. And this is the fundamental shift that we're going to see. And this is replicated all around the world. For legal services and certainly for financial services as well, but if we zero in on legal services, what does that mean? Well, we're going to have an accelerated death rate. So there's going to be an increase in the amount of probate work. Of course, logically, there's going to be an increase in the amount of contentious probate work. There's going to be a lot more estate planning work that is done because we've got this massive shift of wealth. So where does it go? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? How do things move from one generation to another successfully and efficiently? And how do we, the profession, make sure that process is managed as well as it can be? How can we make sure that the demands and the needs of the people who are going to inherit are met, and that the advice that is given on a holistic, intergenerational basis?
That's a super introduction and provides a huge amount of context to the discussion today, Dave. So thanks very much indeed. Arken have recently undertaken some research on advisors and firms' attitudes and preparedness for this transfer. Perhaps you might go through some of the results, Dave, and I'm sure there are some questions that will come out of it as well.
Yeah, sure. Look, it was a great survey to have done. It was 256 individuals, very representative of the Arken.legal client base, and that 71% was large law firms, and then around 17% was will writers, and then the rest was smaller law firms and financial advisors and accountants. And you start to see that influence starting to come through in terms of some of the results that we saw. So when we were talking to or asking the question in the survey of the lawyers about the great wealth transfer, there's some really interesting stats that came through. One of the key ones here is that the average age that was represented in each law firm's client base was typically baby boomers. So 48% was aged between 61 and 70, and then a further 12.5% was over 70. Now, for context, if you look at the generation in behind the baby boomers, the Generation X's, that made up the next biggest cohort of 33%. So people aged from 51 to, let's say, over 71 made up the majority of existing law firms' client bases. What was underrepresented was the millennial generation, so those that are under 50. The oldest millennials now are 47. So, and if you looked even further back to those aged under 40, they barely even register, because those aged 50 and under, or 41 to 50, were only 5%. So that's really interesting. I was talking before about this intergenerational wealth concept and the risks and the opportunities that come out of that. One of the key findings here was that only 23% of the lawyers who responded to the survey actually had a relationship with the beneficiaries of that wealth. And yet 5.5 trillion pounds is going to transition from the baby boomer generation through to the Gen X and to the millennial generation. 5.5 trillion. And yet there is no client base with the people who are going to inherit, and there's no relationship. So that was really an interesting finding, not surprising, because if we think about it, the wealth is held by very wealthy clientele. We've got, and you would chase that money, right? If you're thinking about probate and estate planning fees, then why would you not focus on that? The question comes up in that this transformational shift is starting to happen. And the survey asked whether the clients were prepared to take advantage of the opportunities that will bring. And it was roughly 50-50. 52% said yes and 48% said no. That tells us that they're aware that this is going to start to happen, but there is a disconnect between being aware and doing something about it. Now, pleasingly, from a tech perspective, or from a if you look at it through the other prism, which is an opportunity perspective, the survey also told us that firms were doing a lot of work in and around getting ready, so digitizing processes to be more efficient, opening up more channels. Fantastic. Now, and I think we probably did have a conversation about this, a little while ago, David, it would never have been that number. And so it's really pleasing for the industry to be taking this on board. Now, one thing I will bring the listeners back to is the cohort that answered this, because I think there's a difference between the different quartiles of clients. If we think about large law firms being predominantly the firms that have answered this survey, which is representative of our market and our client base, they've got more operational capacity to deal with these things. If you're a smaller firm, then you probably might be aware of it, but you're struggling with the operational reality of actually doing something about it. So there is that kind of factor to think about.
I think there are some fascinating stats that come out of the report. You picked up on the fact that there's little relationship with your client's children. I was particularly interested in the value of wealth that the respondents anticipate passing. So
Yes.
over a third of respondents said that they anticipated that up to £500,000 and more would pass over to the next generation. That's an astonishing amount of money.
And that's a really interesting area that you've touched on there, David. So if you look at it, 65% of respondents said that they felt that there was going to be more than 200,000 that was going to be inherited by other generations. And you're quite right, that's the stat for the larger inheritances. And in behind that again, of course, you've got regional differences. So those in different parts of the country, as opposed to say the southeast or London, they're going to have different kind of area or amounts of wealth, and property wealth is a large percentage of that to consider. But this is really interesting for us, because if we think about this as an industry, we've got a client base who's telling us that 48% of them felt that their clients were really concerned about what happens to the wealth after they pass.
Mm-hmm.
So they want advice, they want to know that what they've worked hard for is going to be looked after, is going to be transitioned successfully and efficiently, that it's going to have as much risk mitigated as it possibly can. But equally, the other key stat that came out of this was that there was a real expectation from the respondents around beneficiaries taking this wealth into consideration when they're doing their own financial planning. So in other words, there's an anticipation, there's an expectation that mum and dad are going to be passing on, 200,000, 500,000, whatever it might be. And you talk to lawyers and you hear this anecdotally, so this won't be a surprise perhaps to the listeners. But what's really interesting is this is en masse across a pretty representative group. If we think about the number of clients that 234 respondents will be dealing with. So that's on its own interesting, particularly when you think about the fact that only 23% of the respondents who felt that they had a relationship with those beneficiaries. So let's pull that all together. You've got a client base that is really concerned about the wealth being transitioned successfully and efficiently. You've got lawyers who don't have a relationship with the beneficiaries, but you've got an expectation from the beneficiaries that they're going to inherit. Now, if you look at all of that and we think about what that means for the industry, that has to mean opportunity, doesn't it? Perhaps the question, David, is that the interpretation or the definition of what is a client is perhaps needing to be changed. Is a client one person or the testator, or is a client in fact the family? Is a conversation around generational, intergenerational wealth, intergenerational transition of wealth in estate planning needing to take place?
There's an element of a circle here, isn't there? Because you used to have a family solicitor, you used to have a family lawyer, and of course we've moved away from that over the sort of past 20 years or so, and perhaps we're now moving back in that direction. One of my favorite takeaways from the report is that this, again, going back to this point about having a relationship with the beneficiaries, 40% hope to have. And you can't see because it's a podcast, but I have inverted commas here. That we need to be much better than that, don't we? We can't simply hope to have a relationship with these people. We have to make sure that we do.
That's right. Yeah, and we need to execute and take action on that. So what are we doing to leverage that opportunity? Now we can see that there's some digitization of processes and some new channels that are opening up, and that's great. And I think that certainly helps. If we think about it from a technology perspective, which is inevitably where I always land, we're thinking about the amount of data that is held by a practice. And that data, when we think about a will containing the data of who will inherit and who the executor is going to be and what is going to be inherited, is really valuable, because that data can then help a practice, help a practitioner start a relationship with the beneficiaries. But how do you access that data? How do you leverage that opportunity? And that's where the technology piece comes in. And that's a conversation that we'd like to enable for our practitioners and for our clients.
Well, it's not just a conversation that you want to do on a commercial level, Dave. The report demonstrates that respondents anticipate that there will be a demand for more digital services. I mean, gosh, I don't want to keep harking on about Amazon and next day delivery and all that kind of business, because it isn't hugely relevant to the law. We have these conversations quite regularly across our podcasts. But if people are saying, look, we expect a demand for digital services, then surely as a profession we have to respond to that.
Absolutely. Yes. And one of the things that's come out of the pandemic is that this is now across all age groups. There was a study recently, and I'll post the source of this in the podcast, but it showed that 75% of baby boomers are now very comfortable doing things online, like online banking, whereas that wasn't the case pre-pandemic. But if you zero in particularly on the people who are going to inherit, that they have different buying behaviors, they have different expectations. And you're quite right to use things like Amazon, because it is the convenience factor, the habit now factor, the ability to access things, as we were talking in a podcast the other day, whilst lying in bed on your phone. I need to get an estate plan, and you don't need to complete the process, but if you know that you need to do it, and on a Saturday morning you want to get that process started, then inevitably it has to be on your phone, and you need to know that you've actually started that process and it's easy, and that solicitor looks and feels like a solicitor that you would trust. Now, here's the other thing. If that scenario, that use case doesn't come true, then actually coming back to the family solicitor piece, then what triggers it is the life events that usually trigger a will, but also the other stats that say that typically they would talk to their parents or to their friends about who they use and get a referral. So that whole piece is really important. How do solicitors get their brand in front of the people who are going to inherit? How do they commence a relationship with them? How do they build that go-to trusted advisor relationship with these people?
Which rather inevitably leads to one of the points again that you cover in the survey, which is around, well, why aren't firms able to do this? What is holding them back from either building that relationship or engaging in digital or kind of doing this stuff that they know they need to be doing, but aren't always implementing quickly enough?
It's the age-old problem, isn't it? Which is improving over time, but it is the decision-making processes within law firms, particularly around technology. And you see different decision-making processes at different levels of clients. So in quartile 1 larger firms, there's one decision-making process, and in smaller operations at sort of quartile 3 and 4, you've got perhaps much more high street firms, much more partner-led decisions. And the adoption of technology then is different for all of those groups, different drivers, of course. What we're seeing though is that this fundamental shift, this fundamental change is going to accelerate change in the industry. There will be winners and losers all the way throughout the supply chain. And firms need to really decide which one they're going to be. Now, that sounds all very apocalyptic, but we can't ignore the fact that this is a really significant, let's look at it positively, opportunity for everybody, but it's those who will take the opportunity and there's those who won't. So, well, to answer your question, what do people do more or need to do more of? They need to accelerate what they're doing already. So the survey tells us that they are, the 50% are doing different things with digitization and opening up different channels. We need that number to be more like 80 or 90%. So firms need to accelerate the pace with which they're adopting technology. They need to consider their decision-making processes. They need to consider the demographic of their practice and how they make decisions. I'll share this with you, David. Typically what we find, and this is right throughout the pyramid of different firms, is that 1/3 of lawyers will be all in favour of technology. 1/3 will be open to persuasion, and 1/3 will be dead set against it. And that hasn't changed. So there's actually that kind of fundamental shift that needs to occur within firms. Either firms say, we have to do this, and everyone gets on board and just mandate it, or we just need to wait that out, and those naysayers, those people who aren't on board with the technology, will eventually just be left behind, because they won't be able to turn out as much work, and they'll be struggling to make targets.
I often think that running 3 publications, one in residential conveyancing, one in wills and probate, one in family law, gives us an interesting oversight into the different disciplines and the challenges that they each face. And what I see very specifically in wills and probate at the moment is a journey that I think residential conveyancing has been on probably over the last 10 or 15 years, which is about improving process, about creating a better client journey. I note in your report you talk about the fact that firms want to have client portals, for example, to help them manage and review the status of their plans, introduce more communication channels, digital vaults and assets, asset storage, and that kind of thing. All things that we've seen kind of happen in the conveyancing journey over the past 10 or 15 years. So there are lessons to be learned there, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. The conveyancing market is a really good one for us to look at, and obviously within many firms, they'll be doing a lot of conveyancing anyway, so it will be something that they should be familiar with. But there seems to be a disconnect between that and the estate planning part of the business, perhaps because it has historically struggled for revenue as against conveyancing and good sort of property market transactions. But interesting when you look at what people could and should invest in, and the investment that's gone into the conveyancing market has come from outside the industry in some places. So you see some sort of digitization and some change from outside influences, from people who see that. Now we're starting to see that, and the reason that we're going to start to see that, and the reason that we'll start to see more of a nexus between financial services and legal services, and therefore attract a lot more investment, is because of this great wealth transfer. So we must consider the fact that the great wealth transfer will change the industry with other players coming in. We can already see that there's a lot of consolidation in the industry. Consolidation typically will mean that smaller firms are gathered up, and there's a lot of centralization of functions, and with that will come a lot of digitization, and we can expect that process to accelerate, and we can expect more money in behind that to accelerate that process. So we're in for a really interesting time. When we talk about the probate and contentious probate and the whole kind of business of death, if you like, that's something that is on the radar of investment firms.
Mm-hmm.
Because they see the fact that there's this cohort of 16.8 million. They see the fact that there is a real opportunity within firms that have, let's take an example, 200,000 in their will bank. So what does that 200,000 will bank mean in terms of future revenues? Because you're now starting to approach the stage where that will bank, if it's, and the client base, the survey tells us 61 to 70, 71 plus is the biggest cohort of the clients. What does that represent? So from an outside investment perspective, there's going to be some really interesting things starting to change and happen.
So if we're going to put you on the spot then, Dave, obviously appreciate you talking through the results, and as I say, some really interesting kind of things to take away from it. What's the 1-2 takeaways that, if we were going to kind of conclude the podcast and we're fast running out of time, that you perhaps take away from the report and impart to firms?
We are just at the very start of a transformational shift in global wealth, a transformational shift in estate planning and probate work and the business of death. So we enter a really interesting, exciting time. There will be winners and losers during that time. And firms need to decide whether they're going to take advantage of the opportunities that will come from this, because we are in it. The oldest baby boomer is 78. The average age of death is 80 years. We are in it. This is happening whether you like it or not. So the time to start to digitize, to start to have family wealth conversations, to start to consider becoming the trusted go-to advisor for the beneficiaries is now.
Salient words. And I really, really appreciate you coming on the podcast as well, Dave, to talk through the results and just kind of share your experience as well. Thanks very much indeed for your insight.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on today'swillsandprobate.co.uk. My thanks to Dave. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Wills and Probate podcast, one of the leading sources of information for the wills and probate sector. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at today'swillsandprobate.co.uk and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.